In this screencast, we are going to talk about the zero product property with solving quadratic equations. So the zero product property states that if the product, when you multiply two things together, is zero, that one or both of the quantities must be zero. So if you put them together and you multiply them to get zero, one or both must be zero. So for example, if you have A times B equals zero, then A or B or both have to be a zero. So if we take a look at an example, if you take 5 times 0, you get 0. If you do 7 times 0, you get 0. 0 times 2 equals 0. So the only way to get 0 when you're multiplying things together is that one of them has got to be a 0. So we're going to keep this in mind, that you can only use the zero product property if your equation is set equal to 0. So if we have an equation that's not set equal to 0, which we will, we're going to rewrite it so that it does equal 0, and then we can break it down and solve. So for problem 1, we are going to factor and solve for x. So first off, I want to show you that this equals 0, and this is when we do this process. So we're used to factoring, we just factored, so we're used to setting up our rectangle and our diamond. So it's the same process that we used last week. First term goes in the top left, last term the 6 goes in the bottom right. We multiply them together to get the top of the diamond, which is 6x squared. And then the middle term, that 5x, becomes the bottom of the diamond. So we need two numbers that multiply to give us 6x squared, but add to give us 5x. So they're both going to have x's, and you can think about which combination is going to work. And it's going to end up being 2x and 3x. So we're going to plug them into the empty spaces. Again, this is a recap of what we did last week. I'm automatically pulling out the x's there on the side and the bottom. And then I want to see what else is going to go on the outside. So I already know that x and x make x squared. So that's good to go. So now I'm going to take a look at this side here. We need something times x to give us 2x. Well, that's going to be a 2. So that becomes a 2 out here. And then down here, we need something times 2 to give us 6. So that's going to end up being our 3. So our our factors are x plus 2 in parentheses and x plus 3. And again, these could be reversed. You could have x plus 3 first. Equals 0. So we don't want to forget about that equals 0. So this is the additional step. So last week we talked about factoring. Now we're going to talk about solving. So at this point, what you're going to do, and this is very basic, you are going to take each parenthesis and set it equal to 0 and solve. So for example, I'm taking my x plus 2. I'm taking this parenthesis here, setting it equal to 0, and now I'm going to solve. So I'm going to try to get x by itself. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides, and I end up with x equals -2 as one of my answers. Same thing with the other parenthesis. We're going to take x plus 3 equals 0, and I'm going to solve for x. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides to get x equals -3. So we found both of our answers, and we did that by factoring and solving. Now, you may notice, and maybe you don't, and that's okay too, that when we have our factors and our answers, they're opposites. So here our factor is x plus 2, but notice that our answer is x minus 2. Here is our factor is x plus 3, but notice that it's x minus 3. So if you do realize that, you can kind of skip this step of showing all this work and go right to your answers if you wanted to. All right, problem 2, same idea. We're going to set it up. X squared goes in the top left, -35 goes in the bottom right. We're going to multiply them together to get the top of the diamond, and then the middle part, 2x, becomes the bottom of the diamond. So we need two numbers that multiply to give us -35x squared, but add to give us 2x. So we know right now they're both going to have x's, and we need to figure out, okay, what two numbers multiply to give us -35, but add to give us 2. So you can make a list if you want to. Maybe you have some on the top of your head. I'm just going to make a little quick list here just to show you what I'm talking about. So we only have two options, 1 and 35 and 5 and 7. So looking at what we have, we need a positive number and a negative number. So we're going to stick with the 5 and the 7. And we're going to have a negative 5x and a positive 7x. So that would multiply to give us negative 35x squared and add to give us 2x. So I'm going to plug them into the empty spaces, again pulling my x's out, looking to see what else is going to go on the outside. X and x make x squared, so that's good to go. So here I'm going to have a negative 5 because negative 5 and x make negative 5x. Alright, and then the bottom, I'm going to have a positive 7 here. So we can check to make sure it all works out. 7 and negative 5 make negative 35. 7 and x make 7x. So we're left with x minus 5 in a parenthesis and x plus 7 now, equals 0. So we are going to take these parentheses, and now we're going to solve for x. Or you could think about the opposites like I said in the first example, if that makes sense to you. So the first factor, x minus 5 equals 0. I'm going to solve for x, so I'm going to start by adding 5, which is the only step. So x equals 5. That is one of our answers. Second factor, I have x plus 7 equals 0. So I'm going to subtract 7 from both sides to get x equals negative 7. So I'm left with my two answers. Again, we only do this if it says solve and it's equal to 0. So you're factoring what we did last week, and now we're taking it one step further and solving. Okay, example 3, again, same setup, x squared, top left corner, negative 12, bottom right. Multiply them to get the top of the diamond, and middle term becomes the bottom of the diamond. So we need two numbers that multiply to give us negative 12x squared, but add to give us 1. So again, you can think about every whole number that multiplies to give you 12, and then see what kind of combination would work out. So we need the bigger number to be positive and the smaller number to be the negative. So if I take a look, I'm going to end up with negative 3x and positive 4x. So I'm going to plug my negative 3x in and my 4x, pull my x's on the side and the bottom, and then work my way to figuring out what's going to go on the sides. So we're going to end up with an x minus 3 and an x plus 4 equals 0. So now we are going to solve for x. So I'm going to take each factor and I'm going to set it equal to 0. So to get x by itself, I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So I end up with x equals 3. And then this factor, x plus 4 equals 0, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides to get x equals negative 4. And what you're finding is the two numbers that when you plug them back in would make this equation equal to 0. And you could always check. So let's say you plug 3 back in. You'd plug it in for each x. So you would take 3 times 3, which is 9. 9 plus 3, which is 12. 12 minus 12 is 0. So that would work out. Same thing with your negative 4. You'd plug that back in. Negative 4 times negative 4 is 16. 16 plus negative 4 is 12, and then 12 minus 12 is 0. So you're finding what numbers would make this equation equal to 0. Alright, so problem 4 looks slightly different because it's already factored. So this one, all of the hard work is already done, which is kind of nice. So you don't have to factor it out. Please do not multiply these together. You are just going to take what you got, and you are going to find out what x equals. So if x minus 5 equals 0, I'm going to add 5 to both sides to get x equals 5. For the second factor, I'm going to take x minus 4 equals 0, and I'm going to add 4 to both sides to get x equals 4. So this is slightly easier than the other 3 problems we did because we already factored, or we had to factor. This one's already factored for us. All right, problem 5 is similar to what we just did with problem 4, but there is a little bit of a twist. So again, it is already factored, so do not multiply these back together. We're going to take the parentheses and start from there. So we have x minus 8 equals 0. So I'm going to add 8 to both sides to get x equals 8. That is one of our solutions, our answers. Second parenthesis, we're going to do the same thing, but we want to be careful. This is the first time that we have a number other than 1 in front of x. So up till now, you could take the opposite of these, so you could look at that negative 8 and say, oh, it's positive 8. We do not want to do it for this type of second parenthesis here because of that 3 out front. So we're going to start by adding 7 to both sides. So we have 3x now equals 7. So to finish, we're going to divide both sides by 3. And we're going to let that as a fraction instead of changing it to a decimal because a fraction is actually a more exact answer. So our other number besides 8 that would work is 7 over 3. So again, you could go back, plug in 3 times 7 over 3, and that would end up giving you 0, and then anything times 0 is 0. All right, looking at problem 6, we're going to start with 2x squared in the top left corner, negative 3 in the bottom right. We're multiplying those two together to get the top of the diamond, and then 5x becomes the middle of the diamond. We need 2 numbers that multiply to give us negative 6x squared, but add to give us 5x. So we want to kind of think of what combination would work. Remember, we only have 2. We have a 1 and a 6 and a 2 and a 3. We need the top number to be negative, but the bottom number in our diamond to be positive. So that means the smaller number's got to be negative. So if we take a look, we're going to end up with a 1x and a 6x. So if we plug in negative 1x and 6x, pull our x's out, now we need to see, okay, what, in that first column do they have in common? Because notice, x and x do not make 2x squared. So if we take a look at that first column, 2x squared and negative 1x only have a 1x in common. So I'm going to leave that put, so that means that this is going to be a 2 out front. So going from there, we can fill in the rest. So negative 1 times 1x is negative 1x. And down here we'll have our 3. So our factors end up being 2x minus 1 and x, or 1x plus 3, equals 0. So again, we are going to solve for x. We're going to find our 2 answers. So if I take a look at the first parenthesis, I have 2x minus 1 equals 0. I'm going to start by adding 1 to both sides to get 2x equals 1. I'm going to divide both sides by 2 to get x equals a half. Or you could say 0.5, but again, I'm just going to leave it as a fraction. For the second parenthesis, we're going to take x plus 3 equals 0, and we're going to solve for x by subtracting 3 on both sides. And we end up with x equals negative 3. All right, 2 more to go. Number 7, again, is already factored. Do not distribute. That's the number one biggest mistake people do. It's already factored, although it looks kind of strange. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each factor and we're going to set them equal to 0. So that x by itself is a factor, even though it's not in a parenthesis. If it was in a parenthesis, it would look something like this. But because it's 0, we drop that and we just write it as x. So x equals 0, that is one of your answers. Sorry, I don't know why I did that extra. So that's one of your answers. That one's done. So now we're looking at the second parenthesis, x minus 4 equals 0, and we're going to add 4 to both sides. So we have x equals 4 and x equals 0. Okay, for the last problem, first off, you will notice that it does not equal 0. So first thing we need to do is we need to bring that 18 over to the left side. So when we do that, we have x squared minus 3x minus 18 now equals 0. Now we're ready to start with our factoring. So we're going to do our rectangle and our diamond, and we're going to set this up. X squared top left, negative 18 bottom right, multiply them to get the top of the diamond, negative 3x in the bottom of the diamond, and now we need two numbers that multiply to give us negative 18x squared, but add to give us negative 3x. So we have a couple of options, 1 and 18, 2 and 9, and 3 and 6. So we need the bigger number to be the negative, and it looks like the 3x and the negative 6x are going to work. So we're going to plug them back in, fill out the outside, and then we're going to solve from there. So we have an x plus 3 in parentheses and x minus 6 equals 0. So like we just did with the previous problems, we're going to solve for x. I'm taking x plus 3 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides to get x equals negative 3. Second parenthesis, x minus 6 equals 0. I'm going to add 6 to both sides to get x equals 6. And again, if you are aware that you're basically taking the opposite, especially when x is by itself in the front there, you can automatically just take the opposite.